You're about to view an executive summary, a very brief version of the footage covering the April Fool's flood in Farmington, Maine from March 31st through April 2nd, 1987. Here on the Intervale, looking at McDonald's as we pull away, we can see that Hippick Field and the Intervale gateway to Farmington, Maine, was totally flooded, several feet deep. In fact, looking at Cumberland Farms and Giffords in the distance there, we noticed that the water has risen up over the windows in Giffords and up over the gas tanks at Cumberland Farms. This footage is taken the morning after the flood, and the level of water has already gone down on the order of 2 feet. Continuing in the same area, we notice that the gateway to Farmington is impassable and will stay that way for at least another 24 hours. This is the worst flood in history in Farmington. Some people say it's a 500-year flood. Some say it's a 100-year flood. It'll be a time before we know for sure exactly what it was, but there's no question that the water was at least 8 inches deeper than the historic 1936 flood. This is the worst ever in memory of anyone who's been involved in studying floods in New England or in the state of Maine. We're panning down on Lower Main Street right now at the houses that are bordering Hippick Field, and they were all inundated, at least to the first floor, thereby ruining their basements and much of the materials in the first floor of the houses. Here's the geology building where I work. It too received a few feet of water inside. Looking from another view onto Lower Main Street up toward the university at Farmington, we can see flotsam and jetsam floating around, just debris and material that was picked up, much of which was probably carried down over into Hippick Field and maybe even all the way down into the Sandy River and could end up in Popham Beach perhaps someday. This is just another view of the materials that had been floating around on Lower Main Street. They were cleaned up several days later, but certainly caused a significant problem. We're looking out at the Sandy River now, just to the right of Kevin Vining's garage, where there used to be a 5 or 4 bay garage belonging to Bob Bean. It washed away early on in the flood, and when the waters receded, we found that nothing was left but just broken pieces of concrete. Here we are at Center Bridge. Water is not up to the bridge yet, but it's at the highest level that can be remembered. Out in Fairbanks, north of town, we see what used to be the Fairbanks Bridge. 2 of the 3 concrete spans, like the one you see here on the right of the picture, fell into the river catastrophically, and that road is now cut off, and it could cost up to $2 million to replace it. Coming back toward Farmington, we see at the Lambert's trailer park just above the old hospital several trailers, one going off to the right of the picture right now, which was picked up and carried away. There were 7 trailer units there, 6 of them occupied. 1 of them was catastrophically destroyed, and all of the rest had catastrophic damage inside. Out in West Farmington, looking at Marvin's Auto Body and just past West Farmington Pizza, we find that the water there too is at flood level and several cars are flooded. Now, this is just a little bit of footage showing a wheeler, a big truck, a pulp truck, trying to come through the water. It actually made it, and I won't show the whole thing here, but when the white smoke started coming out of the smokestack, as you see here, we were all concerned that maybe they'd bought the ticket, but they did make it through. Out at Walton's Mills Dam area, the water had originally gone over that catwalk. It had gone down now significantly, but still a significant amount of damage. A lot of erosion, as you can see here, where land once ran up to the fence line has been carried away by the water, and the fence itself has been torn up, and we calculate probably $4,000 or $5,000 worth of damage out there that needs to be repaired before the park can be utilized again. The erosional power of this water is just unbelievable. And remember, we're looking at it now several feet lower than what it was before. There's a piece of the sewer pipe that comes out of West Farmington toward the transfer station. It broke and, of course, sent raw sewage into the river, and that's still the case right now. It will be repaired soon, but it's a very costly and time-consuming event. That bridge did hold up, but had there been a lot of ice in the river at the time, that bridge may very well have been carried away. Here is a typical view of many of the roads in Farmington, Maine that suffered severe erosion on the edges. And out here at the Twin Bridges area was an interesting erosion. Underneath one of the bridges, the asphalt was intact, but the material underneath the asphalt that held it up was washed away. Fortunately, the Department of Transportation fixed that up before there were any serious accidents. During the emergency, we used communications, ham radio communications and other types, and they were very helpful to allow us to get information. For instance, in getting help to rescue an 80-year-old lady that lived in that trailer. We came in by boat and took her out around 3 o'clock in the morning and transferred her to a friend's house on Maple Street in Farmington. Panning out over the farmland here, past the Mosier farm in the background, and zooming in on a little sign that says Conservation Tillage, we notice that this is on Route 2. Many of us have gone by this out to the dump, and it's far, far from the river, probably thousands of feet from the river, in fact. And we pan to the right, we still don't see the river. Those trees are not on the border of the river. The river is way off to the right in the distance. And what we're seeing is corn land, intervale farmland, that's covered with several feet of water. Here is the Farmington sewer treatment plant, which suffered catastrophic damage. It was totally inundated. Water filled up the whole inside of the thing. All of the deep valves and pumps and so on were flooded. And it's still not working. And at the state of situation now, we're just sending raw sewage into the river, and that too will be the situation for some time to come before it's fixed. Maybe as much as $150,000 worth of damage. Out on the Knowlton Corner Road, a very small pond and a very small stream coming through a fairly large culvert gave way, and the road collapsed underneath the erosion of the water, as you can see here, and this caused significant problems. Over in the Farmington Falls area, in an attempt to get to Farmington Falls, the town manager and I drove out the back Falls Road because we couldn't get down Route 2 and 4, in hopes of driving to Farmington Falls, but when we got to the intersection with Route 156, it was clear that that was just a hope. We couldn't get there. Looking off into the distance, all we saw was water. In fact, the river was some 6 feet above the roadbed at its deepest point by the sign that you see in the distance. And the green bridge that some of you know is way off in the distance as well. Just couldn't get to Farmington Falls. In fact, the only way to get there really would be to fly, so I hopped in a helicopter, and which was supplied by Channel 13, and flew south along Route 2 toward Norridgewock-Skowhegan to get to Farmington Falls to see what the extent of damage was, again the day after the flood. Here we're just pulling into the Farmington Falls area, and you can see it's totally flooded. There's the Baptist Church with its steeple standing up there, and Goings Electric in the foreground, and several other places you may be familiar with, the ball field and so on, and just a few places that are dry. Coming around by the Farmington Falls Bridge, remembering that this is after the peak of the flood, water is still lapping up on the top of the bridge. Flying back toward Farmington, we get a view from the back of the houses in Farmington Falls, including the church, whose steeple we'll see coming in right here, that are totally inundated, significant damage. Now, coming down the Sandy River over the the Farmington Falls Bridge, looking at the water coming off of the land into the river, we see the Miller House, which is inundated, and Brad Moore's house in the background there. And the Miller House has suffered significant damage, as we'll see in pictures a little bit later from the ground. But the back of the house has been ripped right out. The garage has been picked up and moved and totally destroyed. And for the Miller family, a significant loss. So we couldn't stay up in the helicopter too long, so time to get back down onto the ground and view some more of the damage from the ground, if we ever get there. This is a little bit south of Farmington Falls. The driver of this automobile escaped uninjured, but the automobile wasn't quite so fortunate. Came off of the road when it hit a pocket of water and right into the ditch. Same thing happened to the driver of this 18-wheeler carrying chips, wood chips, toward Farmington. Hit the water, not realizing how deep it was, probably driving too fast, lost control, and the trailer tipped over and lost all of its contents. The Gage family in New Sharon were very unfortunate. They lost 20 cows out of a herd of about 55. Here's just one of the cows, one of 20 that were killed, that he's hauling away with a skidder. Perhaps even more unfortunate, if you can imagine it, than this, was that many of the lost cows were pregnant heifers, so that several, or perhaps most of the 20 cows actually had babies that they hadn't quite delivered yet, and so he really took a loss that is hard to measure in terms of money. But his dairy herd has been decimated, And you can imagine what a horrible situation it must be to have to haul away dead cows like that. This is looking at the Frank Brown residence, also in New Sharon. Frank was evacuated from the second story of this. Water was right up to the top of that little roof you see on the front of the house, and they had to come in by boat and evacuate him. And even a few days later, such as we're seeing here, he couldn't get into his house because of the water. His next-door neighbor, another Gage family, had their garage picked up and moved right out across the fence toward the road. And in the trailer, the Gages woke up at night hearing the dog barking and went around to slap the dog to tell it to be quiet and hit water and found that they were floating in their bed. There's a toy from one of the Gage kids stuck up in the tree. And they were evacuated just in the nick of time. We were lucky we didn't lose a whole family there because the water was up nearly to the roof in that trailer. Looking at the Hiscock residence down in Farmington Falls the day after the flood, we see the water has receded, but it's right up against the back of the house, against the foundation, and it's some 20 feet or 25 feet above normal level. Inside the basement, we see the devastation that was wreaked after the flood waters subsided. They were almost 6 feet high in the basement, certainly over 4 feet high. And looking down at the basement floor, we can see a lot of mess, and it's hard to see here, but the floor is sort of semi-collapsed. A day later, the floor collapsed totally, and I'll show you pictures of that coming up in a few minutes. This is back in the Miller garage showing the automobile that was in there and couldn't be taken out until after the National Guard came to repair the damage on the road. And this simply shows what happened to the garage. Again, a catastrophe. The back of the Miller house shows the heating system that was once inside the house, lying in the backyard in what looks like the river, but actually, as you'll see later, there's a much larger backyard. And the granite blocks which held the house up, the foundation, twisted and moved around. You can see a set of steps in the middle of the screen right here that were moved around. The house, again, was a catastrophic loss. Fortunately, the granite foundation had enough give to allow the water to move things around without tipping the whole house over. So this is looking in Farmington Falls. This is a town road that runs from Route 2 into Farmington Falls past the Miller house. And I'm about 6 feet tall, and you'll notice how deep I am. The road was significantly eroded away, and fortunately at a later time the National Guard came in and helped us repair it. But nonetheless, a significant loss in that area. Again, the back of the Miller house showing where the whole back wall of the house was ripped out and a pipe coming down that eventually hooked onto the heating system. This is Lena Ladd's house, or what's left of it. Lena was evacuated to the fire station in Farmington Falls because her house was flooded. After her evacuation, a propane tank which was connected to the house apparently floated up and the pipe broke, and it caused a house to fill with propane and explode because of a spark that from something caused the house to explode and blow the windows out and burnt the house down catastrophically. This is the entrance to the Farmington Falls Bridge that was eroded away, and this is a shot of a fiberglass boat that was used in a rescue attempt to save Kay Morrill, who lives in this house. They never did get her out of the house. Her road was really destroyed, as you can see here. Driveway was non-existent. And the boat that was used in the rescue floated down, attached to a rope, and smashed in two, and the whole front of it was ripped away. And two firemen fell out of the boat, trying to get into it originally, and were clinging on for dear life for about an hour before some skidders came in and rescued them. Over on the 156 to Town Farm, Back Falls Road, shows the sign we saw earlier from the back, about 6 feet, and the water is now down, but was up about 6 feet across the top of that road. This is at Everett Vinings over in West Farmington, where he has a John Deere dealership, and of course many of his machines were covered with mud and water and so on. This is at the Alexander House in West Farmington, on the right-hand side going out toward the West Farmington Pizza, and unfortunately his basement collapsed. The basement wall just caved right in and took with it everything that was in the basement and destroyed all of the contents. This wasn't the only house damaged in this fashion. The Clark residence right across the street suffered a similar fate when the basement collapsed in on top of the hot water system. Over in the Intervale Road again, after the floodwaters subsided at the Exxon station, we can see them cleaning off tapes, And looking from Hippick Field and panning back toward the Exxon station, we can see that Hippick Field suffered a significant amount of damage. As you know, having driven by there, the fences have been knocked down, and a lot of debris was carried in there. It's still not yet cleared away, and much of the material that was there floated away somewhere else, and even one set of bleachers is still missing. Looking at the 7-Eleven store, we can see them cleaning out the contents that were inside, and the inside was just an absolute wreck. Everything was tipped over, and things were broken and covered with mud and silt and so on, and virtually everything inside had to be picked up, put in plastic bags, and taken to the dump, thrown away. And what a shame. In order to start all over again, they had to virtually take everything out, clean it all up, and restock it. And this can be very expensive, as you can imagine. Most of the stores down in the Intervale suffered anywhere from $30,000 or $40,000 worth of damage up to a more extensive amount. McDonald's, for instance, has lost about $450,000 worth of time and materials. They had to rebuild the whole store. While we were doing this stuff, numerous helicopters were coming by looking at the site, but we couldn't spend a whole lot of time looking at helicopters. We had to look at the damage. Here is McDonald's on the inside. It turns out that the water was up over the cash registers, not over the top of them, but hitting the cash registers enough to cause total destruction of that store. Here we are at Giffords, and I was just pointing out the high water mark. When you go down there for an ice cream next time, take a look at the base of the signs. That's where the high water mark was. And inside, a wreck. Everything was tipped over and flooded. The ice cream, of course, all melted and was mixed together with mud. And what a mess. They could have, I suppose, made up a special April Fool's Day frap, but I don't think anybody would have bought it. They are back in business, and they seem to have recuperated along with everybody else. At the time that we're making this tape right now, McDonald's is still not yet back in business and doesn't plan to be for a couple more weeks. Here we are at the Cumberland Farms store, and they probably got the worst damage of all of them in terms of the percentage of their contents that were destroyed. Virtually everything was tipped over. They're in the deepest portion of the Intervale when the river comes up, and I can't even believe that those shelves in the background stood up because virtually everything on them was destroyed, and the best they could do is just push stuff into a heap. And you can see that the glass doors going to the cabinets had been knocked out, and what a mess. The smell wasn't too good in there either. Well, as time went on, of course, the waters had totally receded, and this is the Intervale now a day or two after the flood where the water has gone down. You don't see what you saw before, but the damage is still there. Looking at the interior of one of the trailers up at the Lambert's Trailer Park, this was a typical scene in any of those trailers. Mud and debris having been floating around and deposited. There's the water line right there. The water was a couple of feet deep inside the trailer, just enough to destroy almost all the contents. But one trailer owner, the Nile family, were not quite so fortunate. Their trailer was picked up, as you see here, carried out of the trailer park and down into the ditch. It was pulled back partially by some skidders, but again, it suffered not only total catastrophic destruction of materials inside the trailer, but the trailer itself was extensively damaged structurally. And if one were to take a look at the floor, for instance, you'd see that that the floor had pulled apart in places, and the beams holding the trailer together apparently have been bent. So this is a total loss, and as I speak to you now, Mona Nile still is residing in the Mount Blue Motel with her family, waiting to find a place to live. And hopefully Red Cross and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and others will help reestablish them in a place to live. This is back in Farmington Falls at the Hiscock residence. Showed you a little bit earlier the water lapping up on the concrete foundation, and then we went inside. Well, we're inside again, but the concrete foundation has collapsed. And that's looking down through the basement floor at the river. There's a stove on the left and the entranceway just up in the upper left, and to the right is where the floor used to be, and what you see hanging there are logs or beams, posts that were holding up the beams. Well, as a result of this, we rented a Ryder truck and evacuated the family immediately because the house is a danger to life and limb. And every day since then, the materials have been creeping further and further down. We hope that in the not-too-distant future, maybe even immediately, we'll be able to start repairing the bank outside, and we would like to hope that we could save this house by building up the bank and then jacking the house up and putting a new foundation under it. But this is really a scary sight, to be standing in the basement and looking down the floor to the river below you. And the only thing that's holding the house up are the wooden beams on the top. This is the Miller house again, a couple of days later, looking at the damage. The road is still damaged here and has not yet been repaired. As I speak to you today, however, the road has finally been repaired, filled in with gravel and sand, but not asphalt. And this is looking at the part of Going's inventory that was salvaged. Much of it was lost outside of Going's electric company in Farmington Falls. And it took days and days to clean that up. Well, this has been a very brief review of the damage of the April Fool's flood from March 31st through 2nd April 1987. And in the days to come, we'll put together a longer version of this tape, which will cover in more detail the destruction that Farmington will long remember.